Good Friday afternoon, everybody. I'm meteorologist Tim Pandages here with your tropical update. Still talking about major Hurricane Fiona that's racing towards Atlantic Canada. We've got two new tropical depressions out in the Atlantic Basin, one in the Caribbean, one in the far eastern Atlantic. Plus, we've still got Gaston out there as well. So a very active basin overall. Today is September 23rd. 2022. So what's changed since we last talked yesterday on Thursday? Well, Fiona raced past Bermuda and brought some impacts. High winds, heavy surf, and a lot of rain too. It's picking up its forward speed, now racing to the north at over 35 miles per hour towards Atlantic Canada. Will be a historic storm for that part of the world, likely the strongest on record in that part of Canada as we get into tomorrow and in the upcoming weekend. 98L, which was an invest, a former tropical wave, as well as 90L, both got an upgrade to tropical depression. So now we have TD9 and TD10. They organized enough to get that upgrade to a depression, but the winds just aren't strong enough to get a tropical storm designation and therefore a name. So we've got dueling tropical depressions vying for that next name on our list, which is Hermine. Whichever gets to that 39 miles per hour winds, tropical storm force winds first, gets Hermine. The following will get Ian. So H and I on the board next. Whichever storm does develop, as you saw, Hermine and Ian. All right, there's a look at the basin, a little more crowded now. In fact, 4 different systems in the basin at once. That's the first time this has happened since 2020. And that was a super active season. This season overall, not very much, but this is just an occurrence there. 4 separate systems and a tropical wave right smack dab in the middle of the main development region that's got a low chance at developing. So here's a refresher on our list of names. We've cleared out one column, 7 names so far. Hermine and Ian up next, and then Julia, Carl, and Lisa. All right, here's the main event right now. We've got the tropical wave that was Invest 98L getting the upgrade to Tropical Depression 9, 35 mile per hour wind, so not quite at tropical storm force yet. And it certainly looks, on infrared presentation, a little bit better than it did yesterday. There was hardly much convection, and a lot of it was over South America. So now it's gained latitude. It now doesn't have as much interaction with land, but it is still heavily sheared. Notice where the center of TD9 is displaced to the east of all the convection or thunderstorm activity. And some of this convection is quite strong. Now we're looking at it on infrared, so it's the temperature of the cloud tops. Very cold cloud tops indicate strong thunderstorms, and cold cloud temperatures are indicated by the white shades there. So certainly some robust tropical convection going on there, but a lot of it's getting displaced from wind shear. And this is much more evident when we switch it up to visible satellite. You can see the exposed low-level center here racing its way on off towards the west-northwest at 14. All the convection is blown off to the west there, so the system itself is getting tilted, and until it can stand up straighter, we won't really see a big jump in intensification, but that is expected to happen as we get into like Sunday and Monday as it moves into a much better environment and out of this wind shear that you can see racing in here from the north and northeast. Strongest is back off to the east now, so it is in the process of moving away from that into a much more fertile environment in terms of wind shear and overall every other condition necessary and key ingredient needed for development is present. One of those certainly is warm ocean temperatures. The Caribbean Sea is some of the warmest temperatures in all of the Atlantic Basin. You can see some numbers on here. Mid to upper 80s is the skin of the ocean temperature, or really the first 5 meters or so, in the mid to upper 80s. That's plenty warm. And looking on its forecast track going to the west-northwest, it just gets warmer from there. On top of that, it's very deep warm water. And that's ocean heat content. That's a lot of energy available for this storm to use to develop, intensify, and deepen. And certainly once it gets southwest of Jamaica there, this is some of the deepest, warmest water in all of the Atlantic Basin. And that means that intensification throughout this area is favored, and that time frame looks to be like Sunday into Monday. So here's how the models do with TD9, the comparison between the European and the GFS. The GFS in the yellow, the European in red. So as we get up to tomorrow, we've got its close center of circulation. Obviously, it's already a tropical depression, but it's getting a little better organized. It's south of Jamaica at this point. Going into Sunday, it now moves closer to the Cayman Islands, south of Cuba. Both models in relatively good agreement, just small displacements east and west in terms of its overall location at this point in time. GFS is much stronger, but European hops on board too as it moves over that deep, warm water, plenty of fuel here. So the European has it just to the north of the Cayman Islands, about to move over Cuba by Monday. GFS is slightly farther to the west, but a very strong storm there as well. Jumping out to Tuesday, European has been on to this solution here of a southwest Florida landfall for about the last 3 to 4 runs. So consistency is growing and we're starting to see a trend emerge here. The GFS has, though, been farther to the west. However, it has been ticking slowly its way on off towards the east and trying to match up with the European. And typically that's what usually happens. The European will lead the way and the GFS later on will get on board and they'll start to lock on. But again, we still have 4.5 days for this to meander and move either east or west or north or south. So this is not set in stone. This is one run of 2 models here. And then going out further in the time into Wednesday, GFS keeps it actually offshore just to the east, or just to the west, of Tampa. Meanwhile, the European moves over central Florida, off the east coast of Florida, and begins to build north. And I will tell you, even in the long range, it looks to even possibly bring impacts to the Carolinas and up to Virginia. So now that it is a tropical depression, we get an official forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center. And notice how I said it's still dealing with the wind shear. Overall conditions aren't ideal at the moment, which is why intensification over the next day or so is modest. We're up to a tropical storm by as early as this evening, getting that next name, Hermine or Ian, and then slowly developing and deepening up to 45-mile-per-hour winds a day from now by Saturday evening. But notice it gets south and southwest of Jamaica. Look what happens. We jump up to 70-mile-per-hour winds, a Category 1 with 85-mile-an-hour winds right over the Cayman Islands. And by the time it crosses over Cuba, moves through the Florida Straits, and heads towards southwest Florida, it's continuing to intensify. And with this particular forecast cone, the center of that cone takes it into southwest Florida near Fort Myers, maybe just north of there, south of Tampa, as a major Category 3 hurricane with winds of 115 miles per hour. Now, the reason why the cone is so much larger at this point in time is because the farther out you go, the confidence drops. So technically, this storm, the center of it, can pass well off to the west there or well off to the east. In fact, the center only stays within the cone 2/3 of the time. So take this with a grain of salt. This will change and adjust as we get more and more computer data. In fact, the next update from the Hurricane Center that includes a new cone, if one is necessary based on new data, comes out at 4 o'clock Central Time. And we'll get an update on the storm's intensity, its location, and the forecast track, as well as watches and warnings. How do all the different computer models see things? We saw the GFS, we saw the Euro. Now, how about all the GFS members, the ensemble members, all the Euro ensemble members, and every other tropical model? Well, here they all are. We're starting to see a consensus grow. They're starting to consolidate and cluster a little bit more. So areas that are more likely to see impacts from what will likely be Hermine or Ian is going to be Florida, is going to be Cuba, and even potentially the Carolinas and up in the southeastern portions of Virginia as we go forward based on this latest round of computer model data. Notice how the forecast cone does mirror this. You have the computer models to look at, and you have a ton of very smart meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center looking at this, and they draw this cone in part based on what these computer models are doing. So you can see that overlap there with the forecast cone in each computer model that we've been looking at so far, and those come out several times a day. So what's going to be steering TD9, Hermine, Ian going forward? Well, it has to do with the upper air patterns, right? So we've got a big ridge of high pressure over Texas now that builds to the west. Another ridge coming in from the central Atlantic. In between the two, a weakness develops. Our chief meteorologist yesterday explained this brilliantly. Look at this as a mountain of air here, this big dome of high pressure, a mountain of air here over the Bahamas, and a valley developing in between the two. The storm is going to want to take the path of least resistance, so it takes that exit strategy to the north, moves through that valley, and drifts its way off into Florida and gets picked up by an incoming trough and cold front that helps nudge it out along the eastern seaboard. Very interesting way to look at it. Here's how it looks in the upper level. So we've got that trough digging on in from the north through the Great Lakes. That is that weakness in the ridging. There's an area of high pressure developing here that further enhances a push to the north. Exactly where that turn happens is still a question, but the models are leaning a little bit more towards around Florida, that it takes that turn north and then gets picked up and pushed off to the north and east there with the upper level trough lifting or digging its way south and then lifting northwards. So there will be impacts here, obviously, with a tropical system. We're talking wind and we're talking rain. Let's look at the probability of seeing at least tropical storm force winds, so 39 miles per hour or greater as we go out in time based on the most recent forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center. So around 80% chance of seeing those stronger winds over the western portions of Cuba and then just off the coast of southwest Florida. We're up to around 60-70% chance of that. Chances of hurricane force winds are slightly lower, and of course at this lead time we're looking 4 days out or so. It's a little bit harder to pinpoint where that core of strongest winds will be. How about timing of when those winds do arrive? Well, we're looking at it arriving on the south coast of Cuba by Monday morning at 8 a.m. and then just to South Florida, Key West area, just before sun comes up on Tuesday morning, and then lifting its way north, looking at the Tampa area by Tuesday late afternoon, early evening, 8 o'clock is that line there. Again, this is based on the most current forecast. This will also be changed and adjusted. Now, how about rainfall here? Tropical systems rain themselves out as they lift to the north, and here's a look at the Europeans' rendition of what happens with TD9 as it lifts north. That swath of heaviest rain is likely going to be located just to the east, northeast of that center, so it's tracking up to southwest Florida. Look at that swath of 4 to 6 to 9 inch rainfall totals, and easily with tropical systems, we could see these numbers doubled based on the forward speed. If it slows down a bit, you see a lot more rain. If it speeds up, these numbers will be lower. How about the GFS? Well, with a slightly different track, notice that swath of heaviest rain just includes that western portion of Cuba, and a lot of that heaviest rain stays just offshore to the west of the west coast of Florida, on the Gulf Coast there. So again, this will adjust based on the overall track, but nonetheless, it's looking like a soaking, flooding threat for Florida. All right, let's jump over to Fiona now. This is racing off to the northeast, 35 miles per hour. So now you can see it getting pulled to the north. It's interacting with the trough and lifting it north, and it's starting to not so much resemble a Category 4 hurricane that it still is. 130 mile per hour winds. It raced past Bermuda, and now it's heading in towards Atlantic Canada. In fact, it's holding on to a Category 4 status. Unusual, because this is the highest latitude a Cat 4 has been since Debbie, and that was back in 1982. And a lot of that is because of how warm the sea surface temperatures are. And I'm going to show you that in just a second, how far north the 80-degree water extends, and that's what you need for tropical development. Here's a look at visible satellite. You can still see there's an eye, but it is starting to get strung out and stretched off to the north, and that wind field expand too as it gains more latitude. Here's a look at those sea surface temperatures. So everything shaded in red here is water temperatures that's 80 degrees or warmer, and it's still in that, which is why it's maintained such major status for so long. Still a Category 3 by tonight, and then as it drifts out of that, we start to see it, I don't want to say weaken all that much, but certainly the maximum wind speeds drops, but the wind field will still expand as it gets farther to the north. There's the official track. Still by Saturday morning, 100 mile per hour winds as it moves right in over Cape Breton and headed towards St. John's as well, with that swath of the strongest winds. Here's that wind cone data here as we get up towards Cape Breton. Look at this, Category 3 hurricane force winds are certainly a possibility there. So at 111 up to 129 miles per hour. This could certainly be one of the strongest storms ever to impact this part of Canada, with a very deep pressure as well. So we talked about all our named storms. Gaston is moving out now to the west in the North Atlantic, not affecting anybody. Fiona, 9, and now we got 10 to talk about. Tropical depression number 10. That kind of snuck in the background. The wave itself just emerged off the coast of Africa and already got a designation as a tropical depression, but it is moving to the north and will not be a threat to land. In fact, it'll eventually dwindle. Here's a look at visible satellite imagery. Certainly a very broad rotation. It's a large wave, but it is building away from land, which is good news. All right, that's the latest for you on the Atlantic Basin. A lot to talk about, a lot going on, a lot changing throughout the weekend, so stay close to the forecast. Until next time, you can find me on social media if you have any questions on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and I'm also on TikTok at TimTalkWeather. Have a great Friday and enjoy your weekend.